street as a word tends to be a word which gets associated negatively with anything it touches. So street life tends to be a low life, and street walking is a negative activity. But I think it's also quite nice to celebrate some of the positive aspects of streets, and I think that's certainly what I'm being interested in. Streets as just simply as the theatre of the everyday, really. The Street Life Network has been looking at how people live in public space, and this very clear distinction that we continue to draw between Southern Europe and the UK, or Northern Europe more widely. So what it is that shapes the way that we perceive the spaces in which we live, mostly around social interaction, the kind of things that people do in public space, be that joyful things like processions and celebrations, and everyday things like having a drink with your friends or a coffee, or the rather more dramatic things like contestation of political events, demonstrations, even types of punishment and violence. The idea is that by getting together the political scientists and the architects and the urban planners with the historians, we might rather nuance and make a rather more subtle discussion. And in addition to the policy, we had artists, so sound artists, we had an author, and we worked quite extensively with an experimental theatre company called Sound and Fury, who helped us in our own understanding of how the public space of streets is a performative space where ephemeral, temporary, theatrical events happen both on an everyday and in a planned way.
Well, I've known Fabrizio for many years, and he was very keen to not just have academics involved in the research work of the history of the street, and particularly in relation to his specialised area of the early modern and Renaissance Italy, but to see it in a contemporary context as well and see where the similarities perhaps and the differences are. And he was keen to get people from other fields, such as the performing arts, to explore and research and discuss and even make work which reflects in some way or explores the nature of the street and our relation to it.
I'm thinking more of the kind of high streets that people quite like nowadays, with cafes and a certain amount, of course, of shopping going on, but maybe an extemporising performer of some sort there, and mixed ages and groups of people with some tourists. This is probably a slightly middle-class, affluent town that I'm describing, but that's probably the parallel.
We take a lot of these ideas into our rehearsal room, where we can play with the ideas of urban planning, of mapping, and seeing how we can create something on stage. These things really do find their way in very exciting ways into the way in which we make theatre.
For me, one of the greatest treats of the network was actually being able to visit some of the places that I've studied over the last 10 years, to Siena, to Florence, to a street theatre festival in a place called Certaldo, where Boccaccio came from, and going with these actors, with this theatre group, who basically opened my eyes to things that I'd partially understood, but only in a historicised way. So how the public spaces of streets and piazzas functioned as acoustic sounding boards, for example, or how processional use was clearly considered in the shaping of street layouts, or elements such as that really did come out as we walked around the city.
Yeah, it was a brilliant trip, and again a real collaboration of ideas, really, because we had these Fabrizio and Georgia who were taking us around the places of Siena and explaining how the streets were mapped out and what that meant in the early modern period, and for us to sort of have a sense of how theatrical they might be. And we were hoping to develop a piece about this, and we also went to Certaldo, quite near Florence, which I have to say was one of the best examples of street theatre I have ever seen. The whole town was taken over with acrobats, with puppet shows, with singers, with shadow puppetry. There were all sorts of really fantastic things. We started embarking on perhaps developing an idea about shadow, a piece about shadow and about our relationship with the sky and the stars. And we did go on to make a piece which has just come out recently, a piece called Going Dark, which actually is about a story about a man who works in a planetarium in the contemporary world, but he loses his sight, and throughout the show, the audience are plunged into total darkness, and we experience a kind of a sonic journey that he makes, peppered throughout this piece, through the street, actually, funnily enough. And I think there were some interesting resonances with the things that we were exploring there at the time. And, in fact, during that period of time, we fell to talking about surveillance on the street with Fabrizio. And he had been talking about the idea of Madonnas and the eyes of God watching over in the early modern period, playing on people's consciences, and how people may kind of modify their behaviour knowing that they may be watched by the eyes of God. Of course, now is a fantastic metaphor for what's going on now, particularly in Britain, with the amount of CCTV cameras that we have all over the place. And we're now completely immersed in the research for a new piece that we're making about surveillance in Britain. And we're commissioned by the National Theatre at the moment for a piece in progress to do a piece about surveillance in contemporary Britain. One of the things I think we've really got from this network that Fabrizio has introduced us to, which is something we really hadn't properly considered, was the impact of architecture on surveillance, actually, and the way in which we observe people, and how that relates to power and kind of crowd control in some way.
The whole point of this was to bring people into a room who wouldn't otherwise be in a room together. I mean, we had a chief constable who took part in it. We've had advisors on police improvement, and we had, quite apart from fantastic feedback from all our participants, but we had incredibly productive days in which we've had the usual outputs in terms of a few publications, and articles will be published and so on. But primarily, what I think certainly a few key members of our network would say is that their research has changed, at least in part, as a result of the people that they've been exposed to through continued participation in the event.